brother. So welcome again to part two of Brother Joshua Feliciano's presentation. We have asked everyone to mute their line for now. What we will do is open it up for questions at the end of the presentation. But once again, Brother Joshua Feliciano, thank you for part one. We are looking forward to part two, and the floor is yours, my brother.
Thank you. So part one was very well received by a lot of people. I did get some feedback from some historians and things like that. I do plan on doing a little video on correcting some small minor details as I have updated my slides from part one. Going into this, I just want to remind everybody that this is done to teach. This is not done to put down. This is done just to state facts, not to offend anybody, because at the end of the day, we are Masons and we stand by research and we stand by the truth. So with that said, I'm going to start my presentation. Real quick, we go over the beginning. The disclaimer: the views and opinions expressed in this video do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of New York or any Masonic body in which I hold membership in. This is going to be called Clandestine Masonry Part 2, Fact or Fake. In Clandestine Masonry 101, we went over the definitions of clandestine, which we know is an irregularity that cannot be fixed, lodges that are created without authority, and have no regularity of origin. Then we also went over the definition of irregular, which we know is a broken regularity that can be fixed, such as belief in a supreme being, admission of women and atheists, sovereignty, and complete control over the first 3 degrees. We also went over the rules of regularity, in which we also stated that the International Compact of 1814 was the start of the rules of regularity, in which the International Compact of 1814 had 3 points that eventually evolved into the rules of regularity, and then the United Grand Lodge of England expanded on that. And we also went over when it came to the rules of regularity, that the regularity of origin was the foundation of determining whether an organization was clandestine, irregular, or regular. In Fact or Fake, today we're going to go over the things that clandestine organizations teach, the things that the members of these clandestine organizations believe without proper research, and which part of those things are fact or fake. Before we start, let's understand that this right here is going to be something that everybody's going to have to understand and really, really remember throughout the entire presentation. History runs in a straight line, not in a loop. So what that means is when something is created, a rule is created, it really counts from that point going forward. It doesn't count from that point and then you can backtrack like retro and it counts back then, because that's not how history runs. So for example, we know that Anderson's Constitution was created in 1723. So anything from that point going forward is what counts. You can't judge anything going backwards, because this is when the rules were created. Same thing for Anderson's Constitution in 1734. They added more to the Constitution, and anything that they added count from that point going forward. The International Compact of 1814, the landmarks have been there since forever, but it wasn't until 1858 where they really started to lay them down and actually line them up and say that there's this many landmarks. And the same thing with the rules of regularity, when UGLE created them, and everybody adopted them in 1926. The first thing we're going to talk about is the things that they talk about, that they say when it comes to the Grand Lodge of England. One thing that comes out that they teach is who gave the Grand Lodge of England their authority. There were lodges before the Grand Lodge of England, and the Grand Lodge of England does not own Freemasonry. No one owns Freemasonry. We're going to go over these 3 topics real quick. The first one is who gave the Grand Lodge of England their authority. We know that on June 24, 1717, 4 London lodges came together at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern in St. Paul's Churchyard, and they declared themselves a Grand Lodge. This was the first Grand Lodge in the world recorded. And at this time, no one gave England this authority because they didn't need an authority at that time. Understand that, once again, History runs in a straight line, not in a loop. There was no rules created at that time. So there was nothing that said that these lodges could not get together and form this Grand Lodge. So they did that. Understand that authority comes from rules put in place after the creation of the Grand Lodge of England. And such examples are the Constitutions of Anderson for 1723, 1734, the International Compact of 1814, these Masonic landmarks, and the Rules of Regularity. You can't really count something from that point going backwards because it's hard to determine whether they were doing the right thing or not because there's nothing set in stone, nothing done in paper. It's almost like when the ancient Grand Lodge of England split from the modern Grand Lodge of England. There was nothing that said that they couldn't do that. This is why when they united later on, there was really no issues. But if you were to take that situation in today's terms, under today's rules, the ancient Grand Lodge of England would have been considered clandestine if you followed today's rules. But because it was back then, these rules were not created, were not put in place. They just called each other clandestine all the time. There were lodges before the Grand Lodge of England. This is something that's always been told to me when I was on the other side. And it's an excuse to say that, if they existed, the Grand Lodge of England created these rules, but, Masonry's been around since forever. But truthfully, let's go get down to the science of this. Mother Co-Winning Lodge number 0. They trace their lineage back down to 1140. They have constitutions that date back to 1598. And they chartered 12 lodges before joining the Grand Lodge of Scotland, with 2 of those lodges dating back to 1678. The Lodge of Edinburgh number 1, they date back to 1599. The Old Lodges of York, they have Masonic documents that go back to 1693. These independent lodges either joined the Grand Lodge or they phased out of existence. So the statement that there were lodges before the Grand Lodge of England is a true statement. But the problem is these independent lodges that were formed before the Grand Lodge of England either joined the Grand Lodge system or they phased out. Plain and simple. And the last thing you also have to keep in mind is that clandestine organizations do not trace their lineage back to those lodges that existed before the Grand Lodge of England. So they make this statement, but they still don't have that lineage to them either. The Grand Lodge of England does not own Freemasonry. No one owns Freemasonry. This is a true statement. Can't go back on this. But here's the thing. Rules and regulations are created by every individual Grand Lodge. With that said, every Grand Lodge is supposed to be sovereign. So once again, while no one owns Freemasonry, there are rules put in place. If you look at sovereignty, the National Grand Lodge is not sovereign. General Grand Masonic Congress, any Grand Lodge under them, is not sovereign. Why? Because the General Grand Masonic Congress still has say in your doings, even though they have more control than any other national body. Modern free and accepted Masons of the world, they're not sovereign. Their Grand Master reports to somebody else. Same thing with international free and accepted modern Masons. These supreme councils, they either start with Imperial, Universal, United, or even National. They're not sovereign. The Universal Reform or anything that's a split organization that it has the lineage to modern free, they're not sovereign. Just because no one owns Freemasonry doesn't mean that rules are not put in place to separate real from fake. Now let's get to the juicy one. This is the good one. We're going to talk about Prince Hall and the things that they say regarding Prince Hall. The first one is African Lodge 459 was dropped from United Grand Lodge of England and lost their charter. Second thing they say, Prince Hall clandestinely created African Lodge 459 in Philadelphia and Hiram Lodge number 3 in Rhode Island. And the last thing that they say is that African Lodge 459 clandestinely created African Grand Lodge. This letter is probably the base and foundation of why they say the things that they say. This is the letter that started it all. In 1960, the United Grand Lodge of England wrote to the Grand Lodge of New York regarding Prince Hall. And here are some key points that we're going to determine, we're going to talk about. This is stated inside of the letter. African Lodge number 459 was dropped from the rolls for non-payment of dues in 1813. And the warrant of constitution of 1784 gave no power to constitute other lodges or Grand Lodge. Let's go over the first one. African Lodge 459 was dropped from United Grand Lodge of England and lost their charter. The United Grand Lodge of England did indeed drop African Lodge number 459 from the rolls in 1813 for non-payment of dues since 1798. The United Grand Lodge of England claims that Prince Hall has sent money to the Grand Lodge of England for the following dues: April 18, 1793, November 27, 1793, and November 22, 1797. The Grand Lodge of England also renumbered African Lodge number 459 to African Lodge number 370 in 1793. The United Grand Lodge of England also never informed African Lodge number 459 of being dropped, or the Grand Lodge of England never communicated with African Lodge about being renumbered. So understand that during this time, there was no communication from the Grand Lodge to African Lodge. If you take this scenario and you take it under the way we are now, if us as a lodge were to drop a member without notice, the Grand Lodge would then look at us and tell us, no, that member is not dropped because under Constitution, you were supposed to inform him. Unfortunately, when this came out and this happened, there was no communication. Continuing on, in 1802 and in 1806, according to Prince Hall's letter book, African Lodge number 459 has sent correspondence to the Grand Lodge of England requesting their status and for a renewed charter, but they never heard back. To get into further detail, in 1802, the letter states from Prince Hall himself, and I quote, "I have sent a number of letters to the Grand Lodge and monies to the Grand Charity, but I have not received one letter from the Grand Lodge for this 5 years." And that is between 1797 and the day that it was written in 1802. So this clearly states that Prince Hall and African Lodge 459 was sending money to the Grand Lodge of England, and they never received it. According to Christopher Haddop's Freemasonry for Dummies, it states, and I quote, "This wasn't surprising. England and the United States were at war again. Clearly, the Grand Lodge of England had no further desire to communicate with them or even acknowledge them." This is a very important thing that we're talking about because during this time, Grand Lodge of England pretty much abandoned the African Lodge 459. African Lodge number 459 had tried to establish communication with the United Grand Lodge of England and the Grand Lodge of England until 1826. And when communication was not returned, they declared themselves independent because of this and other reasons. So at this point, African Lodge felt abandoned and had no other choice but to go independent to continue practicing Masonry. What I have here, this was found directly under the Grand Lodge, the African Lodge 459 records. And what you see here is pretty much I want to call this a receipt for 1793, and it was from the Grand Lodge of England to African Lodge 459. And if you notice, it clearly states that they paid $1.10 for whatever it is that they were paying for. I'm assuming it's dues. It says charity here. Now, the reason why I pulled this up is because it shows proof that at some point until 1793, there was communication from the Grand Lodge of England. After that point, they stopped communicating with them. That's the reason why I put this here. Second topic is Prince Hall clandestinely created lodges in Philadelphia and Rhode Island. Before the Grand Lodge system, you had something called mother lodges. Mother lodges were lodges that were chartered by other lodges. Not by Grand Lodges, but other lodges. For example, Mother Llewellyn Lodge, they chartered 12 lodges before joining the Grand Lodge of Scotland. The Old Lodges of York also have history of chartering other lodges. And Friedrichsburg Masonic Lodge number 4, which I think is located in North Carolina, in the 1960s, they chartered 6 other lodges under the Grand Lodge of Scotland. African Lodge number 459 knew of this and did the same thing by chartering African Lodge 459 in Philadelphia and Hiram Lodge number 3 in Rhode Island in 1797. Furthermore, I tried looking for the Constitution of 1784. And the reason why I tried looking for this Constitution, and I had a hard time finding it, but I couldn't, was because in the letter it clearly states that Constitution is where it states that there was no, they didn't have the authority to do so. But I did find a book, and the book is called A Library of Freemasonry, and it clearly states, and I quote, "According to the constitutions of 1815, lodges to be formed, an ode sung, the petition and other documents read, and in the inevitable oration delivered. After which the lodge is then consecrated, according to ceremonies proper and unusual on those occasions." Now, the postscript to the constitutions of 1723 or in the subsequent editions of that work up to and inclusive of the one of 1784, there is no mention of an OD, of documents, or even, strange to say, an oration. I bring this up for the same exact reason I said in the beginning. History runs in a straight line, not in a loop. If the rule was not created, now not written down, it's pretty much fair game. Perfect example, the International Compact of 1814. This is where limits were put in place when it came to lodges and military lodges. And it's this one point right here that clearly states when limits were placed. That each Grand Lodge shall preserve its own limits, and no warrant shall be granted or revived by any one of these parties for holding of a lodge within the jurisdiction of either of the others. So there's a couple things going on in that sentence. One is the fact that only the Grand Lodge has power to grant a charter or warrant. And two, this is where territory invasion comes in place, where only a jurisdiction within the area is allowed to grant charters. So it wasn't really until 1814 where this rule started really put in place. But once again, history runs in a straight line, not in a loop. Lastly, African Lodge clandestinely created African Grand Lodge. In 1797, African Lodge number 459 in Philadelphia and Hiram Lodge number 3 in Providence was created. In 1808, 1 year after the death of Prince Hall, according to the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, the 3 lodges formed African Grand Lodge. In 1827, they declared themselves independent. So even though they had a Grand Lodge in 1808 to 1827, they still considered themselves subordinate to the Grand Lodge of England. Understand that 14 free and accepted state Grand Lodges were created before African Grand Lodge declared their independence, and 6 of them were before 1808. African Grand Lodge was created in 1784. So understand that the Grand Lodge of New York had a couple of lodges that were directly under the Grand Lodge of Ireland, the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and the Grand Lodge of England. But yet they were still able to form a Grand Lodge. In 1792, Massachusetts, the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, had a merger because there was 2 Grand Lodges there under AFNAM, the Ancients. And I understand that while African Lodge 459 was located in Massachusetts, Massachusetts never asked African 459 to join them. It's a very key point. let's talk about lineage. Lineage is another thing that we talk about when it comes to the things that they teach in the other side. You don't need lineage to start a Grand Lodge. Just because John G. Jones was expelled from Prince Hall doesn't mean he lost all rights and benefits. And PHO can trace their lineage back to African 459. You don't need lineage to start a Grand Lodge. In our ritual, it states something about a charter coming from a competent jurisdiction. We already know this part. I'm not going to go over the ritual. But that one part is very important. Why? Many brothers don't know what a competent jurisdiction is. When you break it down, competent is having the ability, knowledge, or skill to do something successful. And we know that a jurisdiction is an area controlled by a Grand Lodge. So when you put the two together, you would think that a competent jurisdiction is an area controlled by a Grand Lodge, and having the necessary ability, knowledge, and skill to actually make it run successful. But it goes a little bit deeper than that. Being a competent jurisdiction doesn't just mean running an area with ability, knowledge, and skill, but it also means having the lineage so that the passed down information used in the ability, knowledge, and skill is indeed proper. Understand that when you're competent, you have to get this ability, knowledge, and skill from somewhere. It's information that's passed down. You can't just start up a Grand Lodge and expect it to run a certain way without any knowledge of what you're doing. Because if that's the case, you end up with a clandestine organization like Modern Free. You end up with a clandestine organization like International. If you look at their lineage and the way they're structured, they're not structured like a regular Grand Lodge. Why? Because their lineage was created out of thin air. This is why their Grand Masters report to somebody else. This is why they have a crossover system where you go up the York Rite, cross over, and then finish off in the Scottish Rite, which is completely wrong. Because they're not a competent jurisdiction and they don't have the lineage. Let's talk about expulsion for a second before we move on to John G. Jones. In our Article 26, section, in our Constitution, Article 26, Section 1, Paragraph 142B, under penalties and restorations, it clearly states that suspension from all the rights and privileges of Masonry, which shall be definite or an indefinite time. In Article 34, Section 2, Paragraph 260, it states a suspension or an expelled Mason shall not be entitled to Masonic relief, nor his widow, orphan, and children. He should not be permitted to visit lodges, walk in Masonic procession, participate in public nor private Masonic ceremonies, nor to receive a Masonic burial. This, in other words, is losing all rights, benefits, and privileges in Masonry. This is what the word expelled means. When you are expelled, you no longer have any ties to the Grand Lodge anymore. In our ritual, it also states something about an obligation making a man a Mason. But what if that person did not have an obligation to uphold? If you are expelled, you don't have an obligation to uphold, because understand, while you make that obligation to God, it is the Grand Lodge that's giving it to you for you to recite. And you're doing it under that Grand Lodge. So if you are expelled, you no longer have an obligation to uphold. Let's talk about John G. Jones. He is known as the father of bogus masonry. John G. Jones was a member of John Jones Lodge number 7, which is under the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Illinois. This lodge was not named up after him, but named after his uncle, who was a Grand Master for the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Illinois. The general, and from this point going forward, I want everybody to pay attention to dates, because dates are very important when it comes to talking about John G. Jones. The General Grand Masonic Congress states, and I quote, on August 9th, 1889, At Cleveland, Ohio, the late illustrious John G. Jones III revived and reorganized this national body. In 1895, John G. Jones is suspended from the United Supreme Council for creating a bogus Supreme Council with the same name after losing the elections for Sovereign Grand Commander. Once again, he got suspended from the United Supreme Council, not from the Grand Lodge. In 1896, the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge, AF and AM of DC, was created under the General Grand Masonic Congress. In 1897, according to the Clandestine United Supreme Council, he organized the Most Worshipful St. John's Grand Lodge, AF and AM of Illinois, and served as its Grand Master. 1897. On October 14, 1903, he was expelled for unmasonic conduct / creating Grand Lodges without authority. The proceedings of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of 1904 in pages 180 and 181 state that, and I quote, the following their suspension, both John G. Jones and William Gray went about the state setting up lodges with William Gray as Grand Master and John G. Jones as Grand Secretary. In 1908, as Grand Master of St. John's Grand Lodge, he also helped organize Hiram Grand Lodge here in New York. Now, this is all important when we talk about following dates. And I'm going to show you why, because we clearly states that he wasn't expelled until 1903. So he was sitting here setting up lodges and doing everything before that. This is a very important document. And originally, this document was not a part of my presentation. And I give a shout out to Right Worshipful Dave Gillarm, of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Georgia, because he posted this in the group a couple of weeks ago. And I had to put this in my slides because it's very important to actually realize what it states in here. So this was written in 1879. And some key points that we're talking about is that states inside this article, and I quote, the notorious and illegal acts that have been for a series of years practiced upon Freemasonry by William D. Matthews, who styles himself Grand Master of a spurious Grand Lodge in Kansas. This article was written by John G. Jones. William D. Matthews, if you don't know, is the man is the Mason who revived or reorganized the National Grand Lodge after its demise. It also states in this article that he has violated every principle of Masonic law. I further charge him with organizing a Grand Lodge in the state of Nebraska with but 2 lodges, which is illegal. That the so-called Grand Lodge of Nebraska is illegal and clandestine and crooked organization. Now, you may be asking, why am I reading this off of this document? This document clearly shows, and mind you, this is before he was ever expelled, how much he knew about clandestine Masonry and how much he knew from right and wrong. He's over here talking about William D. Matthews and everything he's doing that's clandestine, but later on in life, he ends up doing the same exact thing. And it's a very important thing to understand, that he knew what he was doing. This article that I have here is from the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Illinois in 1903. And you guys know how we have our communications from the Grand Lodge, and they communicate with us who's been expelled and who's been suspended. Well, back then they used to do it through news articles. And I'm going to quote some things directly from this thing to make it easy. John G. Jones was tried and charged preferred against him by Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts for participating with and assisting irregular and clandestine Masons. So this letter clearly states that the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts tried him for doing exactly what we were talking about. After a fair and impartial trial before the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge of Illinois, he was found guilty as charged and given an indefinite suspension. Mind you, this was by the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. And the reason why I'm adding this is because when I have conversations with these members of these clandestine organizations, they're very quick to sit there and say one thing, and that he was tried by Massachusetts and that Illinois was not even there, which is wrong. It's false information. What I have here is a gem. This is from the 1904 proceedings of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Illinois. And the reason why I added this document is because of the fact that they think that this document doesn't exist. They think that he was never tried and expelled by the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Illinois. And this is directly from their proceedings and is a real gem because it's actually really hard to find. And I give a shout out to past master Curtis Black of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas, who posted this a couple years ago, and in my searching, I actually ran into it. Let me read some things that it says right off the back. It says, being of indefinite suspension placed upon him by the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge, assisted by one William Gray, did proceed to confer upon the said profanes the first, second, and third degrees of Masonry unlawfully and without authority. On the next page, the committee met Saturday, November 28, 1904, and proceeded with the trial. Jones and Gray was found guilty as charged by committee and recommended to the Most Worshipful Grand Master that both be expelled. The recommendation of the committee was approved. So not only was he tried by Massachusetts, he was also tried by Illinois. Massachusetts suspended him, and Illinois expelled him. When you speak to these members of these organizations, there are 4 John G. Jones. They think this document and this proceedings does not exist. They think this never happened, and that's false. Lastly, PHO traced their lineage to African 459. This in itself is a whole nother presentation, because to go answer this question, you have to go down the history of the National Grand Lodge. And because of that, on my next presentation, that's exactly what I'll be doing, and I will be answering this question at the next presentation when I go over the history of the National Grand Lodge. This concludes my presentation.
Oh man, that went up. That's deep. That's good, my brother. That was really good, man. Hey, brothers, if you could unmute yourselves. I know we probably have a ton of questions here. I do see the time, but in respect to the presentation, a lot was just dropped on us with some knowledge, facts, and data as well too. So, brothers, what questions? Wide open right now. What questions do any of us have for Josh right now?
Like, what do you think Prince Hall thought of when he was, I don't want to say forced, but in a way dropped from the United Grand Lodge of England to make him want to even create a Grand Lodge of his own with creating lodges here in the States?
So I don't think he was even aware that he was dropped, because he kept sending money to the Grand Lodge of England.
Right.
And
you was even,
there was never any communication for that to happen. So he probably wasn't even aware. They went in, mind you, let's remember that he had passed away before the Grand Lodge was created. But you got to understand that if there's no communication, they felt like there was no choice, and they had no choice but to go independent. Jerry, I see you. Pastor Henderson, you had a question.
Yeah, you gotta unmute. Jerry, you gotta unmute, Jerry. Okay, all right, you take your time. Brothers, questions?
Okay, I got a question.
God knew it was coming. Go ahead, Pastor. Go ahead.
What I didn't hear in the presentation was at what point, or if there was a point that, well, obviously there is a point, that Prince Hall Freemasonry got into right relationship with the Grand Lodge of England.
Yeah, that's when you're saying when they got recognized. That's a whole nother conversation within itself, because at one point the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts was recognized, and then recognition was pulled, and then they were re-recognized later on, and that's when everything changed. That's a whole nother discussion within itself. I can't answer that at the moment because I need to do a little bit more to get dates correct.
Okay.
Fair.
All right. First of all, sorry guys. I had like 10 million things going on over here. I got my niece over here. I got my son, mother-in-law, everybody over here. But first of all, Brother Feliciano, excellent.
Excellent.
Word.
Excellent. You know what I'm saying? Like, listen, bravo, bro. Listen. Anybody could have done that. I shoot them in the foot because they don't know what they're talking about. I got you, man. Hold on. Yeah. See, I told you I had my son up here. But first of all, where did you find all this information from?
You're saying the documents?
Yeah, all the documents. Where'd you find this from?
I went searching on YouTube on Facebook, and what happened was I just typed in keywords into these groups, and you have to know who is credible and who is not.
Right.
And I knew who was credible, who I can take information from, and who I can believe. And you know, the people who I listed were named are ones that I trust.
Right.
And I knew that they were credible.
Listen, man. As far as the history of just Prince Hall and just clandestine Freemasonry in general, you went, you know, like most of the people they go, okay, he's either this lodge irregular or clandestine. You went past both of those. You went somewhere deep.
Right.
I definitely appreciate the history lesson that you gave. Honestly.
Thank you. And you know what? I'm glad you mentioned it that way, because this presentation was more about history than it was about anything else, and that's what I wanted to get across.
Right, because the thing is, people recognize the history of it. People recognize Freemasonry. You see these on Facebook blog groups all the time. Where people say, "Oh, he's clandestine," "Oh, his lodge is regular," whatever the case may be. But the fact is, you actually broke it down, and then when you said, "You know what? I'm gonna separate this. I'm gonna get to the real." That was something important. I really appreciate this, bro. I really do.
Thank you.
That presentation was official.
Yeah. Hey, Josh. So I do have a question for you. There was one slide that you showed a record of receipts that was paid as charity for $1.10. Is there any other record of any monies that was paid, or is that the only actual living document that is a record?
That's the only. That's the only document that I ran into when it came to the files.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't see anything else. I know that they kept sending money because of Prince Hall's letter book. If you read it, and it's actually available in the Google Classroom. If you read the Prince Hall's letter book, in 1802, he clearly states that he's been sending money, and he's not hearing back from the Grand Lodge of England. So that's the reason why, you know, I knew for a fact that he was still sending money.
Interesting. Yeah, man. Hey, listen, props to that presentation. I mean, I think I need to rewatch that 2 or 3 times to actually even drum up some of it. That was a lot of facts. That was a lot of data, but
hell yeah,
that was really good, man. Really good. Brothers, any other questions or comments?
I do have a question.
Go ahead, brother.
Brother Josh. So, what you were saying about, you know, with the sovereignty. So I was always under the impression that it was one of the lodges in, you know, in New York that forced the sovereignty. What I was told was that that
You're talking about Boyer Lodge.
Boyer Lodge. I was told that it was Boyer Lodge that forced the hand. So how does that incorporate what you were saying about the forming of the Grand Lodge and things like that?
So what happened was, if you notice in my slide, I said that because the Grand Lodge of the United Grand Lodge of England never heard back, that was one of the reasons why they went independent. Another reason was because, like you said, Border Lodge forced their hand. If everybody doesn't know the history of Border Lodge originally had asked for a charter from African 459, but they wanted an original charter. They didn't, and what happened was that African 459 had faxed over a copy of the charter, and Border Lodge rejected. So what happened was African Grand Lodge was created, and that's how you got Border Lodge number 1, Rising Sun, Hiram, and I forgot the third one that started the Grand Lodge of the Prince Royal Grand Lodge of New York. They were known as Border Grand Lodge. I see Jerry waving his finger, so if he's gonna correct me, he can correct me. But I have no problem with that.
No, here's the thing. As far as I'm concerned, Adelphi Union Lodge number 14.
Right.
Shout out to the youth. Everybody knows about Adelphi Union Lodge number 14. Adelphi Union Lodge number 14 originally was known as Adelphi Union Lodge number 7 before the Grand Lodge actually formed. So every year, it's like a running thing. Every year, someone from Adelphi Union Lodge comes back to say Adelphi Union Lodge number 7. And they always get turned down every Grand Lodge session. So the way that things are made up, it is definitely compacts and over things. So I got a lot of people here. But it's definitely something that the history of the Grand Lodge New York is definitely something that needs to be researched even more than it is right now.
Right. But what I'm saying is that the first 4 lodges that started Border Lodge, the first 4 lodges that started Border Grand Lodge, that later turned into the most worshipful Prince Royal Grand Lodge of New York. Those 4 lodges were actually chartered by African Grand Lodge.
You know, and the thing is, real quick, I don't mean to get preacherish as a past master, but first of all, you guys know I hate being called past master, and I'm being loud right now because everybody's in the house is loud right now.
That's Master Henderson.
Yeah. So the thing is, you know, as far as like brothers making the commitment to go to their own lodge, it's the fact that these brothers were doing this on horseback. Brothers were actually going to meetings and making grand lodges on horseback. And we brothers in cars in 2020 to go to meetings. That is something that troubles me, honestly, because the history that Josh just spit out to everybody should be recognized and recommended to everybody who's coming into this lodge. So not even just saying.
Hold on.
Aggressive.
PM, your mic is muted.
Yeah, something happened with your mic.
It got real loud in here real quick. Cause I told you I got a house full of kids. I'm sorry. But this history should be celebrated. Josh, I love you, brother. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep spitting this knowledge out to everybody, bro. I'm gonna mute stuff again because it's gonna be a house full of kids. They're gonna scream pretty soon.
Hey man, yeah. Listen, brothers. Any other questions or comments for Josh?
And I gotta say, Josh, man, this is an education, brother. Keep up the good work, man.
Thank you, Past Master. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Very good work, Brother Josh. I just want to add, very good work. And
Thank
this
you.
is very, 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 very knowledgeable. And this is something that we need and that we need to keep remembering and that we make sure we pass on.
Thank you.
For sure. All right, brothers. We are right at about the 8:23 mark here, so I'll wrap this up really quickly. And Josh, just incredible information, man, and congratulations on a really great presentation. There's a reason why you're being requested to join certain presentations and meetings and things like that. But on top of that, the work that you really put in on these presentations can clearly be shown with the direction of of what these presentations come with the information that's provided for it, man. And you put that work in to provide it in a concise and clear and simplistic manner. So I appreciate you bringing that to this lodge. And I know once we let this video out, it's going to be on and everybody's going to be requesting you to join. So
Thank you.
Support you as always, my brother. Thank you very much. And
Thank you,
I
Worsh.
presentation. I thank you.
Thank you, Worsh. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.